Since, as far back as I can remember, an inexplicable terror has gripped me whenever I see a doll made to look like a real baby or child. Not just any doll, mind you, but those eerily lifelike ones that almost seem to breathe. My fear of these dolls began with a haunting childhood memory that has never loosened its grip on my mind. When I was around 10 or 11, I had a particularly harrowing experience that planted the seeds of this phobia deep within me. It was an ordinary day, and I was simply passing through the living room when my eyes were drawn to the television screen. My mother was watching a horror movie, and though I tried to look away, my gaze was riveted by the scene playing out before me. The film featured a doll, but not just any doll. This one was possessed by a malevolent spirit with the head of a goat, buried beneath an old factory. The very idea was grotesque, the doll's twisted smile and dead eyes burning into my young mind. In those few moments, a connection was forged in my brain. Dolls like these were not just toys, they were potential vessels for evil. This thought, once planted, took root and grew until it became an unshakable truth in my young mind. The image of that cursed doll stayed with me, its presence looming in my thoughts whenever I encountered a similar toy. From that day on, my reaction to these dolls was visceral and uncontrollable. The mere sight of one could send chills down my spine, my heart racing with an irrational but overwhelming dread. My parents noticed this change in me. My mother, trying to ease my fears, started by putting away all the dolls I owned. They weren't many, as I had always preferred stuffed animals and plastic toy animals, but their disappearance was a small comfort. Yet, even knowing they were hidden away, I couldn't escape the anxiety that bubbled up whenever I thought about them. It was as if their plastic eyes could still see me from their concealed places. This fear, born from a momentary glimpse of a horror movie, became a constant companion. It influenced my actions and reactions, dictating which toys I could bear to play with and which rooms I dared to enter. Little did I know that this childhood phobia would lead to an encounter so frightening that it would cement my fear of dolls for the rest of my life. The origin of my fear traces back to a day that seemed ordinary at first, but which would become seared into my memory. I was a curious child, always exploring and asking questions. One day, as I wandered through the living room, something on the television caught my eye. My mother was engrossed in a horror movie, a genre I had never been exposed to before. The screen flickered, with ominous shadows and chilling music, drawing me in despite my initial hesitation. I remember the scene vividly. A dark, abandoned factory stood at the center of the story, shrouded in an eerie, otherworldly atmosphere. The camera panned across the dilapidated building, finally settling on a disturbing sight. A lifelike doll, its features twisted into a grotesque smile. This was no ordinary doll. It was said to be possessed by the spirit of a person with the head of a goat, a detail that sent shivers down my spine. The doll had been buried beneath the factory, and its malevolent spirit had been awakened, bringing horror to all who encountered it. As I watched, my young mind struggled to comprehend the terrifying narrative unfolding before me. The doll's eyes seemed to follow the characters, and by extension, me. Its smile was a mockery of innocence, filled with a sinister intent that felt almost tangible. The idea that something so innocent-looking could harbor such evil was a concept that my 10-year-old self found profoundly disturbing. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even as fear began to take root in my heart. The scenes that followed were a blur of panic and horror. The doll moved, with a life of its own, driven by the vengeful spirit within. It tormented the characters, its small size belying the immense terror it inspired. Each act of violence and supernatural power left me more frightened, my imagination running wild with the possibilities. The idea that a simple toy could become an instrument of terror was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. In that moment, a powerful association was formed in my mind. These lifelike dolls, with their glassy eyes and painted smiles, were not just toys. They were potential vessels for something far more sinister. This association grew stronger with each scene I watched, until it became an unshakable belief. My young mind was convinced that such dolls were inherently dangerous, capable of harboring the same malevolence I had seen on the screen. By the time the movie ended, I was left with a lingering sense of dread. The images of the doll and its horrific deeds replayed in my mind over and over, haunting me long after the screen had gone dark. This fear, born from a single viewing of a horror movie, would shape my perceptions and actions in the years to come. It was a fear that I could not easily shake, and one that would soon manifest in a very real and terrifying way in my own life. The impact of that terrifying movie lingered long after the credits rolled, embedding itself in the very fabric of my everyday life. My fear of lifelike dolls was no longer just a fleeting thought. It was a constant, pervasive dread that influenced my every action. The once innocent presence of dolls became a source of anxiety, casting shadows over my childhood experiences. I couldn't walk past a toy store display or a friend's doll collection without feeling a wave of panic. My mother, noticing the depth of my fear, took swift and decisive action. She began by removing all the dolls from my room. Though my collection was small, limited to a few gifts from relatives and friends, each doll represented a potential nightmare. With gentle hands, my mother carefully gathered them up, her expression a mix of concern and determination. She stored them away in a box, placing it on a high shelf in the garage, far out of sight and, she hoped, out of mind. This gesture provided some relief, creating a semblance of safety within my own space. However, the psychological impact of that fear was not so easily contained. The absence of dolls in my immediate environment did little to quell the vivid images that haunted my dreams and thoughts. In their place, I found comfort in stuffed animals and plastic toy animals, figures that to me seemed benign and incapable of harboring malevolence. Despite these precautions, the fear remained a lurking presence. My family adapted to my phobia, making subtle adjustments to our daily lives. My parents, understanding my irrational but intense fear, ensured that no dolls were left out in common areas. Birthday parties and holiday gatherings were navigated with care, my mother always ready to diplomatically suggest alternative gifts to well-meaning relatives. My friends, too, learned to accommodate my fears, swapping out their beloved dolls for other toys when I visited. Even with these efforts, there were moments when my fear was inescapable. A visit to a friend's house, an unexpected gift, or a casual mention of a doll in conversation could trigger a wave of anxiety. Each encounter reinforced the association between dolls and danger, cementing the fear further into my psyche. It became a defining aspect of my identity, an ever-present undercurrent that influenced my interactions and choices. School was no exception. Classroom activities involving dolls or figurines required careful navigation. I avoided certain art projects and play areas, steering clear of anything that might bring me face to face with my phobia. My teachers, informed by my parents, accommodated my needs with understanding and creativity. They offered alternative assignments and activities, ensuring I could participate without fear. Through these adaptations, I learned to manage my fear, but it never truly disappeared. It was a constant companion, shaping my perceptions and interactions. The dolls, though physically absent, maintained a powerful psychological presence. Their influence reached far beyond their physical forms, casting long shadows over my childhood. This phobia, born from a single terrifying movie, had taken root in my mind, growing into an enduring part of my life. It was a bright and sunny afternoon, a day that began like any other. The sky was a clear blue, and the warmth of the sun bathed everything in a comforting glow. My father had gone out for the day, running errands and attending to various tasks, while my mother busied herself with household chores, specifically washing the garage. I was left to my own devices, free to explore and play within the safe confines of our home. On this particular day, I decided to visit my favorite spot, the small cluttered shed at the back of our yard. This shed was a treasure trove of childhood delights, filled with boxes of forgotten toys, old furniture, and various odds and ends that my family had accumulated over the years. But what drew me there most was my beloved pet hamster, whose cage sat on the floor in front of a tall, dusty shelf. Spending time with my hamster was always a joy, a simple pleasure that brought me a sense of peace and happiness. With a sense of excitement, I made my way to the shed. The backyard was a familiar and comforting space, a place where I felt safe and free. The shed itself was a bit of a mess, with its haphazardly stacked boxes and the faint smell of old wood and dust. It was a place where my imagination could run wild, where every item seemed to hold a story or a secret waiting to be discovered. I entered the shed, my eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through the small, dirty windows. The air was cool and slightly musty, a stark contrast to the bright and warm outdoors. I made my way to the hamster's cage, which sat on the floor near the bottom of the tall shelf that dominated one wall of the shed. This shelf was laden with various items, from old books and knickknacks to tools, and, unbeknownst to me at the time, one of the dreaded dolls my mother had hidden away. Kneeling down in front of the cage, I began to play with my hamster, slipping my finger through the bars for it to nibble on playfully. The simple act of interacting with my pet brought a smile to my face, the worries and fears that usually occupied my mind fading into the background. I was completely absorbed in this small, joyful moment, unaware of the hidden danger looming above me. As I continued to play, I felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of unease. It was as if the air around me had shifted, growing heavier and more oppressive. I glanced around the shed, my eyes sweeping over the familiar clutter, but nothing seemed out of place. Shaking off the feeling, I returned my attention to the hamster, determined to enjoy my time with it. Little did I know that this peaceful interlude was about to be shattered in the most unexpected and terrifying way. The day that had started so ordinarily was about to take a turn that would reinforce my deepest fears and leave an indelible mark on my memory. The hidden doll, a seemingly innocuous toy, was poised to become the catalyst for an experience that would haunt me for years to come. As I knelt in the shed, playing with my hamster, I was blissfully unaware of the imminent horror that was about to unfold. My mind was entirely focused on the tiny creature before me, its soft fur brushing against my fingers as it curiously explored my hand. The world outside seemed distant, a mere backdrop to this moment of simple joy. Suddenly, the tranquility was shattered. A loud, unexpected thud echoed through the shed, jolting me out of my reverie. I felt a heavy weight crash down on my back, knocking the breath out of me and sending a jolt of fear straight to my heart. I stumbled forward, my hands instinctively reaching out to break my fall, and I scrambled to my feet as quickly as I could, my mind racing with confusion and terror. As I turned to face whatever had fallen, my eyes locked onto a sight that made my blood run cold. There, lying on the floor in a disturbingly lifelike manner, was one of the dolls my mother had hidden away. It was one of those dreaded lifelike dolls, the kind that looked like a real child. The doll lay face down, one arm stretched out towards me, as if reaching out with a malevolent intent. For a moment, I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest and my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The doll, which had been stored safely on the top shelf, was now inexplicably on the floor. How it had fallen remained a mystery, but the sight of it sent waves of panic through me. The rational part of my brain tried to assure me that it was just a toy, that it couldn't possibly have any ill will or intent. But my fear, deeply ingrained and fueled by years of anxiety, overpowered any logical thoughts. In a blind panic, I turned and bolted from the shed, my feet barely touching the ground as I raced towards the house. Tears streamed down my face, and my breaths came in ragged, panicked gasps. The only thought in my mind was to find my mother, to seek comfort and protection from the terror that had just unfolded. Bursting into the garage, where my mother was still busy washing, I flung myself into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "The doll! The doll wants to get me!" I cried, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. My mother, surprised and alarmed by my sudden appearance and hysterical state, tried to calm me down, gently stroking my hair and murmuring soothing words. But nothing she said could penetrate the thick fog of fear that enveloped me. Despite her attempts to reassure me, I couldn't stop crying. "Please, Mom, don't go back there. The doll will get us," I pleaded, clinging to her as if my life depended on it. My mother, sensing the depth of my fear, agreed to go with me to the shed to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. Reluctantly, I followed her, still trembling and holding tightly to her hand. As we approached the shed, my heart pounded louder in my chest, each step feeling like a march towards doom. My mother opened the door and stepped inside, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to my overwhelming terror. She bent down to examine the doll, which still lay in the same unsettling position on the floor. My eyes never left the doll, half expecting it to move again, to confirm my worst fears. My mother picked up the doll, turning it over in her hands and examining it closely. "See, it's just a doll," she said softly, trying to soothe me. But to me, it was more than that. It was a symbol of my deepest fear, brought to life in the most terrifying way. Even though my mother showed me that the doll was nothing more than plastic and fabric, the experience had already etched itself deeply into my mind, reinforcing the phobia that had haunted me for so long. The moment the doll hit my back felt like an eternity compressed into a single, horrifying instant. I could feel the weight and coldness of the plastic against my skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the sunlit shed. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, each beat a drum signaling the onset of panic. As I scrambled to my feet, my mind raced, struggling to comprehend how the doll had fallen. It had been placed high on a shelf, out of reach, yet here it was, lying on the floor, seemingly by its own volition. The doll's appearance was unnervingly lifelike. Its glassy eyes, framed by synthetic lashes, seemed to stare right through me, and its outstretched arm gave the eerie impression that it had tried to grab me. The details of its painted face, a slight blush on the cheeks, lips curved into a serene smile, were meant to make it look endearing. But to me, they were the features of a nightmare. My initial shock quickly morphed into sheer terror, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent was at play. I bolted from the shed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. My legs moved on their own, carrying me as far away from that cursed place as possible. I felt like I was running for my life, every step taking me closer to safety and away from the impending doom I was certain the doll represented. The short distance between the shed and the house felt like a marathon, my breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps as if the very air was thick with fear. Bursting into the garage, I found my mother still engrossed in her cleaning. The sight of her calm, everyday activity was a jarring contrast to the chaos in my mind. I flung myself into her arms, my words tumbling out in a desperate, frantic stream. The doll fell on me. It wants to get me. My mother, startled by my sudden appearance and hysteria, dropped the hose and turned her full attention to me. Her soothing words and gentle touch were a stark attempt to calm the storm raging inside me. Even in my panic, a small part of me registered the concern in her eyes. She knew my fear of dolls was profound, but the sheer intensity of my reaction now suggested something more than a child's irrational phobia. "It's just a doll, honey." "It can't hurt you," she murmured, stroking my hair. But my mind was a whirlpool of fear and confusion, and her reassurances fell on deaf ears. Despite her own apprehension, my mother decided to confront the source of my terror. She took my hand and led me back to the shed, her grip firm yet comforting. Each step felt like a march towards an inevitable confrontation, my mind conjuring images of the doll coming to life, its plastic limbs moving with unnatural intent. I clung to my mother, my tears blurring the world around me, my pleas for her to stop mixing with sobs. We reached the shed, and my mother paused at the door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The air inside felt even heavier than before, as if the shed itself had absorbed my fear. She approached the fallen doll cautiously, her movements slow and deliberate. Bending down, she picked it up, examining it closely. "See? It's just a doll," she said, her voice gentle but firm. To her, it was nothing more than a toy, a harmless object made of plastic and fabric. But to me, it was the embodiment of my deepest fears, brought to life by a combination of childhood trauma and the inexplicable incident that had just occurred. Even as my mother held the doll, turning it over in her hands to show me its harmlessness, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow alive, that it had moved on its own with malevolent intent. My mother placed the doll back on the shelf, securing it more firmly this time. She turned to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and determination. "You're safe. It can't hurt you," she said softly, but as we left the shed, my fear remained more potent than ever. The incident had reinforced my belief that these dolls were not just toys. They were vessels of something sinister, a belief that would haunt me for years to come. The incident in the shed had left me in a state of utter terror, and as my mother led me back into the house, I couldn't stop the tears from streaming down my face. My chest heaved with sobs, and my mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. My mother, ever the source of comfort and stability, sat me down at the kitchen table and made me a cup of warm milk, hoping to soothe my frazzled nerves. She sat across from me, her eyes full of concern, as she gently pushed the cup towards me. "Drink this, sweetie. It will help you feel better," she said softly. Her voice was calm and reassuring, but I could see the worry etched in her features. I took a few tentative sips, the warmth of the milk offering a small measure of comfort. My mother reached out and took my trembling hands in hers, giving them a reassuring squeeze. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" she asked gently. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself as I recounted the events in the shed. I told her how I'd been playing with my hamster, completely absorbed in the moment, when I suddenly felt the doll fall on me. As I continued to recount the events, my mother listened attentively, her face a mask of calm and understanding. Once I had finished, she stood up, determination shining in her eyes. "Let's go back to the shed," she said gently but firmly. I hesitated, fear clawing at my chest once more. The thought of returning to the scene of my terror was almost unbearable. "I promise it will be okay. We'll figure this out together," she reassured me, and with her hand in mine, we slowly made our way back to the shed. As we approached the shed, every step felt like an eternity. The once familiar path now seemed fraught with unseen dangers. My heart pounded in my chest, and my grip on my mother's hand tightened. She opened the door cautiously and stepped inside, her presence a beacon of safety in the dim, cluttered space. The air inside felt heavier than before, filled with an almost tangible tension. My mother walked over to the shelf where the doll had originally been placed. She picked up the doll from the floor and examined it closely, turning it over in her hands. "Look, it's just a doll," she said softly, showing me its lifeless plastic face. But to me, it was more than that. It was a symbol of my deepest fears, a physical manifestation of the terror that had haunted me for so long. She placed the doll back on the shelf, this time ensuring it was securely positioned. "I think it must have fallen off accidentally," she said, trying to offer a logical explanation. But as she looked around the shed, her brow furrowed in thought. She seemed to realize that the doll had been placed too far from the edge to simply topple over on its own. This realization added a layer of mystery and unease to the situation. I clung to my mother, still trembling, as she continued to investigate. She noticed a few other items on the shelf had been disturbed, suggesting some kind of movement or vibration might have caused the doll to fall. But the unsettling part was that there was no apparent source for such disturbance. The air in the shed was still, and the ground outside was solid, undisturbed by any recent activity that could explain the sudden fall. My mother's face grew serious, and she turned to me, her expression one of both concern and resolve. "I'll make sure this never happens again," she promised, and together we left the shed, closing the door behind us. She decided to move the doll and the other stored toys to a more secure location inside the house, away from any potential sources of disturbance. The attic seemed like the best place, a space rarely visited and far from my usual play areas. Back inside, as my mother carried the doll up to the attic, I felt a lingering sense of unease. Even though she was doing her best to reassure me and provide logical explanations, the fear remained, deeply embedded in my psyche. The image of the doll falling, its outstretched arm and lifelike appearance, replayed in my mind like a scene from a nightmare. Once the doll was safely stored away, my mother came back down and sat with me. "I know you're scared, and I understand why," she said, her voice filled with empathy. "But I promise you, it's just a doll. It can't hurt you." Her words were comforting, but the fear didn't dissipate entirely. It had taken root too deeply, fed by years of anxiety and the recent inexplicable incident. The days that followed were a mix of relief and lingering dread. The doll was no longer in the shed, and my mother's reassurances helped to ease my immediate fears, but the memory of that day, the sight of the doll seemingly moving on its own, left an indelible mark. It reinforced my belief that these dolls were not just toys. They were potential vessels for something sinister, an idea that would haunt me well into adulthood. Even as I grew older and learned to manage my fears, that day in the shed remained a pivotal moment. It was a reminder of the power of childhood fears and the way they can shape our perceptions and reactions. And while I could rationalize away many of my childhood anxieties, The image of that doll, its outstretched arm and lifeless eyes, stayed with me, a testament to the enduring power of fear.